Birth of a book is always a cause of celebration, and Kitab is that forum, and Kitab provides a platform to authors to display and showcase their newest literary works. We are gathered here to celebrate the launch of Vikram Sampath's extremely well-researched new book, Savarkar, A Contested Legacy, Part 2. So much has been said about this great historical figure, and I don't know whether I should even use these words because everything leads to some kind of controversy. But I think when it comes to writing history or studying history or the historical figures, not only do we need to be multidimensional, but because semantics matter, I think we need to use the word a cubist approach to see a historical figure from not just a point of view or a B point of view, but different points of views. So that's my contribution to this session, the cubism part of it, which was a big art movement. And as we know, Vikram Sampath has written fantastic books, Splendors of Royal Mysore. My name is Gauhar Jan. I have yet to read it, and I'm very curious about that. Voice of the Veena as Balachandar, and Savarkar, Echoes from a Forgotten Past. He was awarded the Sahitya Academy's first Yuva Puraskar in English Literature in 2012, and the ARSC International Award for Excellence in Historical Research in New York for his book on Gauhar Jan. In 2015, Vikram was among the 4 writers and artists to be selected as a writer in residence at the Rashtrapati Bhavan. He's a trained Carnatic vocalist, and he has established the Archive of Indian Music, India's first digital sound repository for vintage recordings. In conversation with him is a very feisty, my sister, Shubhrastha, who I'm still to locate here. Great. Thank you. Shubhrastha, as you know, is a noted columnist. She's the founder of The Churn. And yes, with immense pleasure, I announce that we have with us Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman ji, the Honorable Minister of Finance and Corporate Affairs. Along with her, we have Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance. And I would request Dr. Sampath and our eminent panelists to come on the stage, please. Khair Maqdam karte hain aap sabka. Can I now request Ms. Shinjini Kulkarni from Ehsaas, she's an Ehsaas woman, Noida. So I'm Ehsaas woman Delhi, she's Ehsaas woman Noida. We compete ever so gently to come on stage and felicitate our wonderful guests. Can I please request everybody to unveil the book? Before I ask Nirmala ji to say a few words, as a member of Prabha Khetan Foundation, I'd like to share, an anecdote with all of you. So cut back to I take the liberty of doing so with your permission, Vikram. So let's go back to 2012, when I was part of India Against Corruption. It was not an Aam Aadmi party. It had not become a political movement by then. And we were always jousting in studios, and Nirmala ji was there, and as was I, in various studios, presenting the BJP point of view, while I was talking against essentially one party, the ruling dispensation of that time. And obviously there was verbal fencing and jousting going on at all the time. And I remember at one point of time, because Nirmala ji has always been very warm, and there is a fun side to her, and all of you know her as this fabulous FM and all of that, but I'll tell you something about her. This is 8 years back or 9, I think. And I was there waiting for the car to pick me up and drop me back to my house. Nirmala ji was also waiting to go back. Nirmala ji, in 2012, where were you? Where did you stay at that point of time in Delhi? 2012, Anna Hazare days, movement days. Rajendra Nagar. So she had, because from GK1 to Rajendra Nagar was a distance, and I was rushing to go back, but there was no car to drop me. She was there, yeah, she doesn't remember it, but I remember it, and it's etched in my memory, because I want to tell you who she is, who she really is as a person. And she saw me like really hassled, wondering as to how I'm going to go back home at 10 p.m. And she said, she just got out of the car and she said, Shazia, my car can drop you. And I said, no, you have to go a long way, Nirmala ji, rehne dijiye. She said, no, it's really late. You can't keep waiting for the car. She made it a point to stay, watch the shenanigans that took place, and offer me. And we went back, and she dropped me back to the house. And we didn't discuss anything about politics. We just discussed about life in general, living in Delhi. So that's who she is. That's important for all our sisters from Prabha Khetan Foundation and Ehsaas women to know. So, yes, and it's deeply etched in my memory. So that's a true sister, really. We salute you for that and for who you are.
Thank you.
And there is, I believe, is there a Hindi version of? Yes. Okay. So I would request Nirmala ji to say a few words.
Thank you, Shazia. Before I utter a few words on the book, it's essential to have organizations like the Prabha Khetan Foundation, because books are written and books are written. Of course, some books are very differently written. But to have platforms like the foundation, Prabha Khetan Foundation, you have an opportunity to savor things first in a select company, and probably even go back to exchange a thought here or there with people who have attended the program along with you. And that builds a nice sort of camaraderie with people who are similarly placed in attending book releases or any such events. So at the outset, thanks for the foundation, Prabha Khetan Foundation, for giving this opportunity. About Vikram Sampath, so much can be said. The first thing which strikes me is the consistency with which he does rigorous research, and not on easy subjects, on subjects on which all of us would say there's not enough researched. But somebody has to do the research. And many of us are tempted to join conversations about these very important personnel without really adequately having well-researched material in our hands. So we get going into conversations and then probably realizing that there are things with which we could have argued a case, whichever case be it, argued a case much better if only we were able to access such quality, well-researched, primary source-based researched books. And therefore, you know where I'm coming from and what I'm going to say, and this is on which nobody can differ. Veer Savarkar is one such a very important personality in Indian history about whom so much is discussed, so much is talked. And I wouldn't mind one day just stopping each one of them and saying, tell me what is the foundation or the basis on which you're giving me your view, your opinion, your subjective interpretations. Right or wrong, you have, my God, so much being discussed. And I'm so pleased to know that Veer Savarkar attracts so much conversation. I fully want the conversations to keep going on. But informed conversation most of the time is missing. And that opinionated conversation is also not based on this fact or any other fact. And as a result, it becomes based on emotions, on strong likes and dislikes. But we are in the process doing a big disservice to the nation, because Veer Savarkar, like leaders, stood their ground, thought out ground, and And as a result, their contribution is distinct. We cannot afford to miss that distinct strand which also contributes to Indian history. So it might sometimes align with some, let us say, political ideology. Some other times may not align with the political ideology, may even sound as though it's aligning with an opposite ideology. But that is where we need well-researched, solid, fact-based biographies or books on such leaders. And I would first of all give credit, not just for the research, but the credit which has to be given to Vikram Sampath for having taken this subject, having continued the research. Of course, he credits it to the inspiration his mother has offered and what the absence of his mother has cost him or made him suffer, where he had fallen back on the support his father has given him, and so on. But you would think, does it matter when you're writing a book? You are writing as an individual. But I would think, particularly when you're writing on subjects who are otherwise going to provoke a lot of sensation, controversy, you need that support from the back, from the side, from whoever you think can give you that support. And unfortunately, a trial for him has been the absence of the mother, from whom he took a lot of inspiration. So, one, for choosing the subject; two, sticking with the subject in spite of odds; and third, the extensive research that it requires. Today, Volume 1 has been around in the town for some time. And even if you said something which is truthful about Veer Savarkar, there could be, no, how dare you, this is not right, he was this, he was that. Volume 1 has only elicited a lot of interest. Volume 1 has only made people sit up and say, oh, these are the facts about Veer Savarkar. And nobody's saying, no, he's put this book through, but it's not well founded, not researched. No. In fact, there has been this silent desire to have the second volume come soon. People would whisper saying, hey, volume 2 is awaited. But that is the way in which Vikram Sampath has used facts, convincingly placed facts, and as a result has made people say, we need to wait for the second book. And second book is what is here before us. And therefore, it's not an easy thing to pick a subject like this, sustain your interest in it, and to make you feel this is a definitive final word on a person like Veer Savarkar. And for that one singular service, I applaud the work done by Vikram Sampath. Very timely, very much rich in content and fully backed by facts. This is what we need of people, of great leaders who have contributed to the country in their own way. You agree or disagree. But there is no space which should be left for conjecture. And Vikram Sampath has helped us to be able to speak about Veer Savarkar with a lot more confidence and strength. Of course, they are quite bulky.
Yes.
But if we believe that we want to contribute to this debate, each one of us will have to at least little by little go into every detail of what this book is provided. Even as I was talking about this, that I have to come this evening to attend this program, I have my uncle with me, who is a voracious reader and who's got a lot of his own views on a lot of things, and I derive a lot of strength and comfort from him. He recalled that one interview, the last interview of Savarkar, in which he goes into great detail about how he escaped, how he jumped out, sensing that there's trouble before him, And this was all in Marseille, I think, in France, and so on. And I said, hey, hang on, what are you telling me suddenly and all that? If it's not in this book, you're giving me a figment of your imagination. Although, of course, we have heard all these earlier. But there it was. He'd completely given the entire last interview of Veer Savarkar, which in a small cameo fashion gives you the entire life, entire person's conviction, the extent to which he was involved. And he recollects that was in 65, 66. He recollects every one such a thing that he did with no ambiguity, meaning he was fully convinced, his conviction lay there, and therefore he could say, that's how I did it, no problem. And of course, Vikram Sampath somewhere nicely recalls that, and sometimes it made you feel that he probably is aligning with Nehru. Sometimes he didn't agree at all with the Sangh, with the RSS, with the Swayamsevak Sangh. Sometimes he stood his ground on something on which all of the community to which he belonged, which suffered after the Godse trial, started disowning him. How could you? You're a Chitpavan Brahmin. How could you speak about no caste Indian society? How could you sit and have a conversation with everybody? Those sort of remarkable bringing together the conviction and the justification for standing alone, even if it means standing alone, have all been captured in this book. I wouldn't want to take more of your time. You're going to have a beautiful conversation. But giving me this opportunity, made me feel absolutely humble. There were days when I had fairly closely had chat with him when he was compiling the recorded Indian music archive. Those were the days when I had spent a lot of time conversing with Vikram Sampath. Of course, he's gone through his own tribulations, but he's made of a different stuff. So no tribulation can affect him. And for that one point, I derive a lot of inspiration from him. I really think Indian research on particularly matters which pertain to a freedom movement, about our cultural, social oneness. You need many more Vikram Sampaths, and even many more such endeavors from Vikram Sampath himself. And I think all of us would feel very proud to be in association, also to know him, and if possible, I'll be of some help whenever. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nirmala ji. Really, now you've heard her yourself, and she really is a picture of humility and modesty, besides that, of brilliance that you see all the time. Vikram, as Nirmala ji was mentioning, from Marseille, the journey to the Hague Tribunal, and then literally being forced to extradite to India by the British, was because of the fear that Savarkar evoked as a revolutionary, because of the archive, and because he called 1857 he was the first one to call it the First War of Indian Independence. So we'll hear more of that. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your kind words. Wonderful to have you. So proud to announce that we have a Hindi version as well of the book, which we will, Volume 1. So not of the new one, but the Volume 1, and which we will, Sanjeev ji, please. So over to Shubhrastha for the conversation that we all await. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this session. Welcome back, Vikram. As we all know that Vikram suffered a huge bout of COVID. It was really unsparing to him, but we have the brave heart with us. So, congratulations, of course, on the book.
Thank you.
Thank you for agreeing to do this, and Sanjeev ji, thank you for taking out time. Let me set the context behind today's discussion. Sanjeev ji is a historian. Vikram ji is a historian. I have dabbled into writing a little bit of a slice of history from the Northeast Indian region. And before we begin a discussion on the book, let me ask two fellow historians on the panel today how difficult it is to unearth these interesting but very contested points of views from our immediate and historical past. And also, what message do you have for young researchers and young scholars who want to be historians tomorrow?
This is a googly in the very first ball of the over. I think Sanjeev is best placed to answer first.
First of all, let me congratulate you, Vikram, for completing 2 marathon volumes. Let me say that when he embarked on this adventure, I had warned him not to do 2 volumes. And I had told him, however you do it, please make it 1 volume. But he then said, no, I am going to do 2 volumes. And I'm glad he didn't listen to me. Because this is literally the last word on Savarkar in many ways. I don't think it is possible after this effort to write anything more on this man. Because he's literally been through everything that has ever been written or thought about Savarkar. Every piece of paper that you can imagine, I think he's gone through. And I would say it's extremely readable. Even after the first volume, I told you that, I'm not a person who easily reads through thick volumes, but I did, with great interest, go through the first volume, and I'm halfway through the second one. I've not finished it, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it, so it's very well written. So for something this thick, readers don't get thrown off by the thickness. It is absolutely scintillating. It's like reading, at least the first volume was, and even this one, at least the bits I've read, reads like a spy thriller. So it's excellent work, very well written. I would go as far as to say that this 2-volume set may be the best biography ever written by an Indian author. This is now to Shubhrastha's question. The point is that it is okay, in my view, to have debates about the past. After all, you switch on the television any evening, and we are debating things that happened yesterday. So why shouldn't historians have different views about what happened 2,000 years ago? Therefore, the debate is therefore not about whether people have different interpretations of different events, but whether or not those debates are based on facts. So everybody has a right to their own opinion, but they don't have a right to their own facts. And unfortunately, and this is where it is, I would say, largely an India-centric problem, because debates happen everywhere else in the world. But I'm quite shocked, particularly in the field of history writing, how little many of these debates are actually based on primary evidence. This is, by the way, true of modern history, medieval history, ancient history, and which is, of course, good for an amateur historian like me, because I am able to very often simply slice through well-known arguments of mainstream historians by the simple expedient of going and looking up whatever it is that they are commenting on. And I am very often shocked that, there are books and curriculums and all kinds of things written based on, without having actually even bothered to consult the original facts. So this is something that is a rather serious issue. We have debates on, Aryan invasion or the Mauryans or the medieval, Turkic invasions, etc., without anybody bothering to look up the original facts. And this is a real problem, because you can't have a meaningful debate if people are not even looking up. And incidentally, the further back in history you go, the amount of facts is actually not that much. I mean, if you were discussing Ashoka, for example, one weekend is good enough to read through all his edicts many times over. So it doesn't require a lot of effort, but nobody bothers to do this. So when you come up with somebody like Vikram Sampath, who goes and reads up everything worth reading about some modern historical character on whom there is tons of stuff from his own lifetime, it requires some effort. And I have to say, salute you for putting in that effort. It's really, really well done.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. That means so much for me. Thank you, and a very good evening to everyone. It feels like a culmination of a long journey. It's taken me 5 long years to put together these 2 volumes. And in these 5 years, to actually, be emotionally, intellectually, physically also involved all the time with a character, and at the same time, the biographer's conundrum, that when you actually commit it to print, you need to become emotionally distant from it, and not end up as an advocate for the protagonist. And a protagonist like Savarkar, who has so much to be defended and alleged on either side. So that's a very difficult task to emotionally cut yourself off, because I think there's a very thin line between a biography and a hagiography. So consciously, I've tried to ensure that an objective assessment of the man is done. To Shubhrastha's question, I mean, it kind of baffles me that even during the height of the British Raj, you had nationalist historians like V.K. Rajwade, Jadunath Sarkar, so many others who, Savarkar himself, an amateur historian, who could actually put together a nationalist version alongside a colonial historian or an orientalist viewpoint. But then it is really baffling that in independent India, an alternative narrative to historiography is not even allowed. What was allowed during the British times, we can't do that in independent Indian times because of the thraldom in which I think Indian historiography has been held by a kind of a Marxist, hegemonical hold on the subject. It's a dog in the manger. I will not allow anyone else to come anywhere close to, the writing of it. Anyone who has an alternative viewpoint is not encouraged. They pay a price for it. They've paid a price in the past, with livelihoods having suffered, and academicians who depend on fellowships, on all of these kind of things, most of that being denied to anyone who has a view which is different from what was the mainstream Sarkari Darbari version of historiography. And probably 20 years before, we could not even be having this kind of a mainstream discussion or even a book written.
That too in India International Center.
And to add to it, the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, which gave a fellowship to me, senior fellowship, to research on Savarkar. It was a comic, irony of sorts in many ways, considering the deep personal antipathy that Nehru had for Savarkar. My problem is not with someone hating a particular individual or their ideology or so on, but as I think Nirmala ji also mentioned, it needs to be informed and not based on conjecture. The problem was so rife that I was in Mumbai, and I discovered from the archives in the Raj Bhavan that one of the governors of Maharashtra, Shri Prakasa ji, who was there as the governor of, he was also the first ambassador of India to Pakistan. He was a great admirer of Savarkar apparently, but throughout his term as the governor, he could not muster courage to even go and visit him at his house in Bombay and pay his respects. And it is said that it's only on the last day of his tenure, and that too in stealth. As a common man, he goes in a taxi and meets Savarkar and says, there would be dereliction of duty if I actually left Bombay state without calling on you. But the establishment would keep a hawk's eye on who I'm meeting and what would happen. That would obviously affect his career. And so this was the kind of social untouchability, political untouchability practiced against a man who ironically all his life championed an eradication of untouchability. I've often quoted that anecdote of how someone of the eminence of Pandit Hridaynath Mangeshkar ji lost his job in All India Radio for the crime that he committed of actually tuning Savarkar's poems, Marathi poems. He was a prolific poet also. Sagara, Pran, Tadamalala that he'd written, and so for which Mangeshkar ji got a show cause notice as to why did you pick this poem. And he's on record saying he gave a 2-line reply saying, good poem, a great poet. shouldn't that be reason enough to tune it to song and have his sisters, Lataji, Ashaji and others sing? But just for that crime, he lost his job. So we are talking of this kind of anathema towards a person, this kind of intolerance, which we now claim has happened only now. But then freedom of speech, intolerance, so much so that, as I said, you may love to hate someone, you may love to love someone, but at least let there not be a cancel culture against their very discussion about that person. Year after year in Europe, we have probably biographies of Hitler also, which are written. In India too, right from, every year we keep reevaluating characters of the past, whether it is Gandhiji or Pandit Nehru or whoever else. But then the last biography written on Savarkar in a comprehensive manner was way back in the 1960s by Dhananjay Keer, in English at least. And nobody thought it important to reevaluate a man whose philosophy, whose idea, Hindutva is talked about every day on news debates, in newspapers, in public discourse. But the progenitor of this philosophy, what was his motivation, what was his life, that nobody discussed. So when we talk of historiography and history writing, I think the landmines that are there, where we have these dog in the mangers, these no-go subjects, you're not supposed to make an honest assessment of the past. I think those are the issues that historians in India grapple with, and within those landmines, how to actually navigate your course and try to make an objective assessment, where I think as they say, jnanam paramam balam. So once the facts are there, once the documents are presented, then there is very little slander or counter that one can do. So I think that's the advice, if you say, to younger people, that it's a lot of hard work, but one must be ready to put in that hard work to ensure that to rubbish a book, the other side needs to do twice the amount of research, and that's not going to be easy for many people to do.
Vikramji, taking cue from a word without which Savarkar cannot actually be discussed, Hindutva. In a day and age when we have all these global campaigns to dismantle Hindutva, it's really important for us to revisit what Savarkar's idea of Hindutva was, because it was very different from the Hindu Mahasabha or the RSS idea of Hindutva. It was, though Hindu Mahasabha did take Savarkar's tenets and introduce it in 1925. This is all I'm tempted not to quote from the book. Please read the book to be able to get these contexts. But it's important to ask this question. Why is it that despite the popular support that Savarkar got for all his pronouncements against caste, against the whole idea of Hindutva per se, or his idea on Hindu-Muslim unity, why could he not build political allies? If I remember correctly, Ambedkar did not even share stage with Savarkar, despite both of them having mutual admiration for each other. So what is this idea of Hindutva, according to Savarkar, which made even the Sangh uncomfortable? And why is it, and this is a question to Sanjeev ji, why is it that today when we talk about revising history and all these questions, why haven't we able to look at this question of revising history with respect to academia? The syllabi needs to change. We all have led campaigns in one way or the other. What is it that stops the government from taking this step? Vikramji, you first, yeah.
That's, I think it'll take the rest of the evening to talk about that. But then, in brief, I don't think you said he was popular in garnering support. He was actually not popular. One of the biggest backlash that he received for his work was actually, ironically, from the Hindu community, the orthodoxy. Everywhere that he went after his release in 1937, other than the Congress, if there were anyone who actually made murderous attempts on his life, it was actually the Orthodox Hindus, who were aghast by these kind of path-breaking social reforms. Imagine in the 1920s and 30s, we are talking of the first inter-dining cafe where people of all castes can sit together and eat, at a time when even among the Maharashtrian Brahmins, the Chitpavans and the Deshasthars would not break bread together. The first temple where people of all castes could enter, the Patit Pavan Mandir in 1931, and a complete eradication of untouchability to the extent that in schools, children of all castes could sit together and study. All of this done in Ratnagiri in 13 years that he was there as a pilot project. And you brought up Dr. Ambedkar. Curiously, he wrote several laudatory letters to Dr. Baba Sahib, and he said, this is a pilot project I have done, and I'd like to showcase this to you. And since I have restrictions only to be in Ratnagiri, why can't you pick this up and scale it up to the whole country? Every time Baba Sahib Ambedkar wrote laudatory letters saying, you're the only one who understands that the Varna system is at the root cause of the Jati Pratha, and its eradication is important, but curiously never gave some excuse or the other and never shared stage with him. So this whole, the governor of Maharashtra example that I gave, I think that predates then, that anyone who even was seen in his vicinity probably paid the price with their career. And Dr. Ambedkar also had political ambitions, and he was in the Viceroy's Council in 1942. I'm sure even sharing stage with Savarkar would have cost his career a lot. So that's why curiously there is a lot of praise for him, but I don't want to be associated with you. And his other issue that he brought up when it came to caste reforms was the typical narrative of an upper caste exploiting the lower caste. But he said, to have a completely casteless society, even among the so-called lower castes, there are so many sub-hierarchies. And he wrote that to Ambedkar, that in your Mahar community, you actually do not allow those below your hierarchy, the shouldn't say this word, it's politically incorrect, the Bhangis and all of that, who are there, who should not be allowed into a Mahar well, who cannot enter a Mahar Vada, who cannot pray at the Mahar temple. So that is also untouchability, that is also caste system. So it's not just an upper caste, Brahmin, Thakur, all of them exploiting the lower caste as is made of. There is a hierarchy of caste distinctions, and all of that has to be eliminated, to which again, there was curious silence. So I think a lot of these, and his famous pronouncements on that he does not consider the cow to be, worthy of worship. It's just a useful animal. If you want to worship it, you do it in the precincts of your house. Of course, that didn't mean, as some people on Twitter these days say, oh, but he ate beef. There is no proof that he ate beef. And he said if the cow is being slaughtered only to slight the Hindus and their faith, then that he has a problem with it. But otherwise, he said an animal that sits in its own, and these are his words, not necessarily I agree or disagree. An animal which sits in its own excreta, you're actually elevating it to the level of a goddess, and that's an insult to both humanity and divinity and all of that. But if you really want to worship it, you worship it in your house. Don't let it enter public policy and the life of the nation. So all these thoughts, which even today's India, it would probably raise so many heckles. Consider someone doing this in the 1920s and 30s. So he was so unpopular among people that I think he was a man way ahead of his times, where he did not also realize that an orthodox traditional society like India, you had to bring in reforms slowly, piecemeal, and Gandhiji understood that. He understood the pulse of the people, and so it was step by step. It was not like a nihilist approach where we will demolish the entire edifice and rebuild a new structure. That takes time, and the society is not ready for it. Probably many of his views the society would not be ready for even today. So that was his biggest flaw, where he failed to cultivate allies. They tried that very limitedly by aligning with the non-Muslim League Muslim parties, the Krishak Praja Party in Bengal, Fazlul Haq, and also the Unionist Party, the Ittihad Party in Sindh and so on, Sikandar Hayat Khan, to form coalition governments to ensure that the Muslim League's hold that it was the sole opinion maker of Muslim political opinion in India was diminished, and you could have, create dissensions within the other side and ally with them and form governments. But even those experiments failed, largely also because of Savarkar's, he was an ideologue and a thinker, and not really a mass leader or someone who could actually take along a party. His party too crumbled even during his own lifetime. He could not even make common cause with his protege, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who eventually broke off and formed the Jan Sangh. And the Mahasabha, after 1946 elections, when it was wiped out, it literally evanesced into nothingness. And those are also some of the flaws of the man, where you can be a great ideologue sitting in a room and conceiving ideas, but to be a mass leader, you probably need different kinds of skills, which he sadly did not probably cultivate.
So, to take up the issue of rewriting history to reflect reflect a more nationalist view, some may argue, or I would argue reflect at least the facts as they are, and then you can put your own interpretations of them. And why are these not reflected in our textbooks? That is the question you asked. So let me clarify. First of all, I'm going to answer this question as Sanjeev Sanyal, the writer. There is another ministry in the government that's job is to do this. So don't bring the finance ministry into this. First of all, it is an issue that I have spoken about very widely. Many of you may see various WhatsApp versions of my speeches floating around. So obviously, I feel very passionately about the need to do this. I think it is something that we are working towards, and I know there are some people working towards it. But there are some things I do want to say that we need to first settle. One of them is that in order to begin to change curriculums and so on, you actually need to get the hard academic work actually done. This may sound a little tedious, but as you can see, even on somebody who is, as you know, Savarkar is pretty mainstream, at least from the debate perspective. There was almost nothing much written about him and research till Vikram came along. And this is, incidentally, even more true of many chunks of Indian history. For example, early Indian history, there is a lot of new information now from on, for example, the early periods of the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and so on. And these old tropes about Aryan invasion, etc., which, you know, there are still a few journalists who try to keep those alive. But by and large, these have all been now trashed by genetic data, archaeological data, and all kinds of new data. In fact, the story of ancient India is radically different and is radically changing as we speak, because we are finding so many new things. So give you a flavor of this, even today, even those who are in favor of changing the narrative, they are still stuck with this idea that Bronze Age India was essentially about something in the northwest of the country. This is actually not true, because just at the same time as the Harappan, Saraswati civilization in the northwest was flourishing, there were actually well-developed civilizations in other parts of the country, particularly in the Gangetic plains. But there is some evidence that they also existed in other places like Odisha, even in southern India. It certainly is the case that the Iron Age took off in southern India. Now this is all information that is popping up from archaeology, etc., in the last decade. But there is simply no consistent research being done to put it all in one place and interpret it. And so somebody has to go in there and begin to dig all this up and write this out. Same thing is by the even in modern Indian history. Now we all know and that, you know, this Congress party's view of the struggle for Indian independence is an incomplete one. There was certainly a, the sort of non-violent movement for Indian independence led by Mahatma Gandhi. But the impression you get from reading it is that, you know, we all politely asked the British to leave, and they, being gentlemen, left. But there is an entirely different story, of which, of course, Savarkar was one of its founders in the beginning as a revolutionary. There is a violent resistance to British rule, which was actually very active, but you barely hear about it in all our textbooks. You are left with the impression that, you know, yes, we haven't forgotten Bhagat Singh and Chandrasekhar Azad and Raj Bihari. The names haven't been forgotten, but you'll get the impression that there were individual acts of bravery, and that was the end of it. The fact that they were a part of a consistent movement and that they all knew each other, there were connections, and they had, you know, in the First World War, the Ghadarites, for example, had, an embassy in Germany. They had networks all over the world, including in the US and Japan, and of course in the Second World War they set up the Azad Hind Fauj and so on. The point of the matter is this is a consistent story, and they are the same people trying to do the same thing over and over again. Raj Bihari Bose attempted to do a version of the Azad Hind Fauj in the First World War, failed. He succeeded in the Second World War. It's not Netaji, but Rashbihari Bose who set up the Azad Hind Fauj. So what I'm trying to tell you is that there are these threads of history which are not consistently again written down in one place, even by those who agree that things need to be changed. So there has to be a lag of time for this new literature to be written. And this is what Vikram is doing, is really a part of that effort. I've made my own small effort that I'm trying to do in the specific case of the revolutionaries. I'm in the process of writing a book about them and their contributions to Indian freedom struggle. But the point I'm making is this is finally getting done piece by piece. So it requires some patience. It has required a lot of breaking through the barriers created by the Marxist Nehruvian establishment and their almost Stalinist control over academia. And it is slowly but steadily breaking through. In fact, I'm quite amused very often that some of my what would have been considered till recently scandalous views on characters like Ashoka are now repeated back to me in central Delhi parties, which means that I am finally breaking through on some of those. So what is happening is that the Overton window itself is shifting, which allows for many of these stories to be told. And I think, therefore, in some ways, the changing of the textbooks and the curriculum is not the beginning of the process, but the culmination of the changing of narrative based much more on fact, based on a wider variety of opinions. That is in the way, in the sense that this book itself is part of a new sort of movement to reevaluating who we are.
Sanjeev ji, related to what you said, you're working on a book on revolutionaries. While going through Vikram's book, I realized that there's very little written about the family life of the revolutionaries. If one can romanticize the idea of Taj Mahal, why is it difficult for us to even try and understand what Yamuna Devi might have gone through, Savarkar's wife, and the kind of economic hardships, for example, that Savarkar faced, and the way he and his family sort of sailed through it to produce different creative ways of expressions that Savarkar and Vikramji. Before, I'll obviously hand it over to Sanjeev ji. The way in which I meant popular was the fact that last year, when we did that conversation on the churn, if you remember, there were these young people from all across the country, without having much context, as Nirmala ma'am just said. They created an entire creative program for the entire day based on whatever little snippets were available from history. So he might not have been a mass leader, also because whenever he came back to Ratnagiri or wherever he went, he couldn't have a public procession of sorts. But the popularity of his views or the long-standing impact that Savarkar had. So coming back to this, despite all this huge contribution that bravehearts like Veer Savarkar had on the Indian psyche, why is it that we as Indian readers are diffident in accepting them as human beings and we don't get to see the human side in history that is written about them? It's very professional, as if they took birth, they committed themselves to this cause of poverty alleviation, social issues, etc., etc. They had some contestations with respect to legacy questions, and they fought with so and so leader, and then they were martyred or they died.
Well, very simply because those who consider a luxury suite in Naini as a jail cannot understand Kala Pani. When you read about what happened in Kala Pani, it's basically like Auschwitz. And it's extraordinary that after independence, the cellular jail in Port Blair was almost torn down and destroyed. It's almost like you are getting rid of the evidence. It was only at the very last minute that 2 of the wings were saved, and they are now preserved for posterity. And even that attempt to save whatever was left was actually quite controversial. So it tells you the way in which our history was deliberately distorted and presented in a certain way in order to tell one narrative, whereas all alternative narratives were to be simply removed from public memory. And it's a very sad thing. And so it is, so therefore everything around them also had to be wiped out. Them as human beings, their family life and so on was slowly kind of edged out of public memory so that there wouldn't be any conception of who these people are. And one of the reasons for this, ironically, is that you have to understand that India was ruled for so long by a very small group of people from far away was because they had support of a fairly strong collaborator class. And this collaborator class not only benefited under British rule, but one of the tragedies of Indian history is that at 1947, when we became free, the collaborator class, oddly enough, became the establishment. So as the British left and they vacated various senior positions, it was not the people who necessarily fought for freedom who got those positions. Most of who went on to occupy those positions were actually the collaborators, and after that their families, their children and grandchildren in some cases. And one of the fun things about reading and researching a book about the revolutionaries and that period and then the subsequent period is also reading about who wrote about them subsequently. It's quite interesting that almost the entire intellectual class, particularly historians after independence, were all themselves either collaborators or direct descendants of collaborators, including most of the founders of India International Center. Now,
how to get us evicted out of this place?
No, why? It's a matter of record. I can give you written letters on this. And I'll give you one example of this. All our textbooks, by the way, go on and on. Hindi, if you study Hindi, you're very likely to read about somebody called Yashpal, the writings of Yashpal, and he writes about his life as a revolutionary.
Singhavalokan.
Yes. So now, since I also happen to come both from my mother's and my father's side from revolutionary family, so let me tell you what my family thought about this chap. Well, they spent a good part of the early 20s trying to kill him. Why did the revolutionaries want to kill Yashpal? Well, because he was the source of the information to the police which led to the killing of Chandrasekhar Azad. Okay? Chandrasekhar Azad himself suspected that he was a revolutionary, that he was an informer. He had in fact given instructions to kill Yashpal, which hadn't been carried out. Sadly, he passed on information to the police on the basis of which in Allahabad, oddly enough, he was trying to get to where my family was at that time living in Karnalganj, not far from Alfred Park. And he was gunned down based on the information provided by Yashpal. Later on, Yashpal pretended a great deal that he was a great revolutionary, and then he staged a gunfight in which he was captured and kept in jail. But let me point out, he was not sent to what would be considered a respectable place for revolutionaries to be sent, which is Kalapani. He was in fact kept in the best jail, in the best part of the jail, and oddly enough was allowed to not get married and keep his wife with him in jail as well. Clearly he was not being kept there as a prisoner, he was being kept there to protect him from other revolutionaries. Even worse, after independence and somewhere in the 60s, a CID official called Dharmendra Gaur found letters in the Lucknow CID records where in 1946 there is a letter by a British intelligence officer to another British intelligence officer saying that we are about to leave now. Please make arrangements for this gentleman called Yashpal, who was very helpful to us. Useful fellow. In 1930 and 31, which is, by the way, when Azad was killed, and then in some subsequent dates he is also given. Now, we know all of this, and yet one of the biggest intellectuals of post-independence India was Yashpal. He was given all the literary awards you can imagine, including, if I'm not mistaken, the Padma Bhushan. So if the post-independence history of India And you can go on. I can give this sort of storytelling for pretty much all the well-known historians and intellectuals of that time. Then how are you going to have a new narrative? Because most of those who were writing the post-independence history were invested in covering their own tracks. And some of them were direct descendants of people who, after Jallianwala Bagh massacre, actually raised money for Dyer and O'Dwyer when they left. So these are the kinds of people who wrote our history subsequently. So naturally, they were trying to tell a kind of story. Now that all has to be slowly dug out and an alternative has to be written. It takes time, but we will do it.
To add to what you mentioned, Sanjeev, Yashpal's story was in my mind when you were asking that question, that those who actively collaborated with the British were actually taken very good care of. And just that fact, in the case of Savarkar, whom the common narrative is that he was a stooge, he was a collaborator, and all of that. If he was one, there was no reason for the British government to actually keep him under surveillance. He was a useful fellow too, because he was a well-read lawyer from London, and he could be used especially after 1937, when governments started getting formed in different parts of India. He could have been the first Prime Minister of Bombay State or something like that if the British actually trusted him and if he had actually sold out to them. On the contrary, what was initially a conditional release, that only for 5 years he had to abstain from politics and that he had to be restricted to Ratnagiri alone, every time it came up for a review, the British reports, which I quote in this book as well, say he's not to be trusted, he's a very dubious guy. And that was because all through that time, on the one hand, of course, he was a social reformer, but the Jekyll and Hyde game that was going on was both Savarkar as well as his elder brother Baba Rao were constantly in touch with the revolutionaries, with your granduncle Sachidanand Sanyal, with Chandrasekhar Azad, with Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh quoted Savarkar so extensively, including making notes of the Hindu Padpadshahi that Savarkar wrote in his jail notings. And there's a lot of flourish about Savarkar that he writes. Durga Bhabhi is supposed to have stayed at the Savarkar residence in Bombay, where Savarkar's younger brother Narayan Rao, his wife, taught her to disguise herself in a Maharashtrian sari and also wear a Maharashtrian nath, so that they could conduct the shooting case in Bombay, famous as the Lamington shooting case. So all of this he was doing ostensibly on the outside. No, I'm not dealing with politics. I'm a social reformer, and true to heart, not as if it was just to hide the underground movement that he was doing. But there was never a time when they actually gave up on the revolutionary movement. Sachindranath Sanyal, in fact, ensured that Savarkar got connected to Raj Bihari Bose. And then it was Netaji who visited him in 1940, in June 1940, where it is said to be Savarkar's inspiration to advise to him, saying there's no point doing civil disobedience and the forward block that he had started. Rather, dushman ka dushman dost hai, so you go and ally with the Japs and the Germans and all of that when the war was going on. And that's how that circuit got completed. So for this reason, the British never trusted him, and the 5 years restriction that was put on him extends to 13 years. It is only in 1937, and that too, the government in Bombay, though it was a Congress government, they actually put a condition on the British government saying, till you release Savarkar, we will not form a government here. There was some coalition problems and all of that. So under a lot of duress, in 1937, the British government finally released him. The Congress did that because they were very, very keen that Savarkar joined the Congress. And there were overtures all through, because he was an important functionary. But he's supposed to have famously said that I would rather be in the last row of the patriots than in the first row of the traitors. And he considered the Congress to be, very high on treachery, because they had gone too far, according to him, in in the Muslim appeasement, which sowed the seeds of partition of the country. So I think this and your other, about the family, we seldom speak about that, because both the brothers, Baba Rao and Vinayak Damodar, were in jail in Kalapani for 14 years. And in that period, their respective wives, his wife Yamuna and his sister-in-law Yeshu Vahini, they were socially ostracized. They didn't have money to even run their livelihoods. It was left to Madame Bhikaji Kama in Paris to actually send money to the Savarkar family for sustenance. They came from a landlord house, and their entire property was confiscated by the government, including the vessels of the house. Copies of the Bhagavad Gita, books that were there, everything was taken away by the government. They had to start life all over again. And society actually ostracized them, saying, Khuni ka parivar hai, we will not associate with them. So it was with that kind of sacrifice that these women actually managed to run their household also, till the time the husbands came back alive, thankfully, from Kala Pani. And today, sitting in, air-conditioned rooms and on social media in 240 characters, we say, what was his contribution? Oh, he was a stooge. Oh, he was a traitor. So it's very easy
so
to...
the best bit is that very often you'll hear, this is not the India ancestors fought for. And then you discover that the ancestors weren't fighting for India at all.
And degree is being snatched away, including Savarkar was a lawyer, bona fide lawyer in London. His law degree from London was taken away from him. His bachelor's degree from Fergusson College taken away from the government. So on paper, he was only a metric pass. So there was no way, even after coming out to Ratnagiri for captivity, he writes to the government saying, I'm a trained lawyer. Can I do something and practice? And the government refuses. So how is a man supposed to earn his livelihood? And so he starts his newspaper called Shraddhanan, where again every letter, every word is intercepted and seen with suspicion. So a lot of fake pseudonyms and so on that he writes these articles in. So it was a tough life they led.
Vikram, while going through the book, one thing which really struck me is the care with which Savarkar used his words, because he was always under surveillance, but he was a poet at heart. And he's very superfluous with the kind of, when he gets into a passionate discussion, I think he's extremely superfluous with words. However, the caution with which he writes about really contentious issues of the day is very telling. As a historian, how do you rate Savarkar as a historian too? Because he had a certain view of Indian history. Do you think the ideologue in him takes over? Do you think the poet in him takes over?
I think so. And yeah, I wouldn't rate him very highly as a historian at least. He did a lot of research. 2 years he spent in London at the British Archives using their documents against them, from what was hitherto called a Sepoy Mutiny to the first war of Indian independence, that word also being coined by him, and this masterpiece of a book that he wrote on 1857, which became an inspiration for Bhagat Singh, for Netaji, for so many others, decades after it was written. But the flourish with which it was, I think there the poet took over. History, I think, calls for dispassion while writing, but he gets carried away in the emotion of it and leaves it to a lot of multiple interpretations, which bring him to problem even today. One instance is, of course, that 6 golden epochs of Indian history that he wrote, the last book of his life, where, in like a poetic way, he says something which is used against him to this day, that he advocated rape as a tool against any community and so on. But that was certainly not what he said. If one reads the Marathi original, and knowing the language when I read through it, I was quite aghast by what the interpretation is made out to be. What he said was, in those early, decades and centuries of invasions from the Turks, the Arabs, and the Mongols, and everyone, we were having a kind of a perverse virtue, a displaced sense of ethics, when our opponent did not actually, adhere to the same war ethics. Right from the Mahabharata times, both parties had to agree to an unwritten code of warfare. After sunset, we will not, fight. We will not stab someone in the back. We will not attack unarmed people. We will not attack women, children, old people who cannot defend themselves. These were all unwritten codes of warfare, which both parties agreed to. Now here you had a new force which came from another country, which did not comply with these tenets of ethics of warfare. But we were quite stupid to actually continue to practice that, thinking it's a great virtue to be virtuous, whereas the opponent actually thought of us as cowards. They did not give us any brownie points for all of this. So he quoted in that Shivaji Maharaj, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, and Chimaji Appa, they let away some of the women captured during one of those invasions and the wars. If those Indians in the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries, the Indian side, the Rajputs and others who were fighting the war, if we had paid back the enemy in the same coin and had, ensured, put that fear of God and fear of retribution in their hearts, that if we attack their temple or molest their women, we'll also face a similar situation, then probably they would have been more cautious in dealing with us. They would not have committed the atrocities they did on us and the genocide of Hindus that they committed. What use was being virtuous with a group which did not see that virtue as a plus point? So that was what he said. Many women would have actually been saved had we followed a policy like this, where we, instead of the Gandhian principle that you slap one cheek, I show the other cheek, you slap two back, so that the other person is not courageous enough to then attack you. Now that is written in Marathi in a poetic flourish in such a manner that today in a news debate, someone can come up and say, in the 6 epochs of golden epochs of Indian history, Savarkar advocated rape as a tool in today's context against a particular community, which was exactly not what he said. So he was a very, very bad historian, I would say, who the poet, as you said, rightly took over when it came to putting it together. And history writing needs a cold, objective dispassion, according to me, and not given away to so much emotional outpouring.
And I think, Vikram, you've done a fantastic job by situating this entire discussion. When you talk about Abdul Rashid and the conversation that Gandhi had with him, how he addressed him as the brother, and then Ambedkar and Savarkar's fault lines with respect to their views. The final question with which I would want to wrap up this session is, when you look at India's debate, the debates that happen in India today, it's very reminiscent of what was happening in 1920s. The same tone and tenor with respect to questions on caste, the same tone and tenor with respect to questions on Hindu-Muslim unity or disunity, the same tone and tenor when it comes to issues like Ghar Vapsi today, Shuddhi then. How do you see this, and what has changed since then and now, or is it the same situation? Sanjeev ji.
I mean, these are long debates, civilizational debates, and what is interesting is when you read many of these writers, and of course you have written, we are talking here specifically of Savarkar, but in fact these debates were happening more widely. It's not just him. I mean, if you read Lala Lajpat Rai, or you read Sri Aurobindo, then before he became a spiritual guru, he was known as Aurobindo Ghosh. If you read many of their writings about many of these issues, even Ambedkar, many of them would now be considered bigots. What it tells you is that there has been a certain illiberal left capture of the Overton window of what is considered civil discourse in such a way that you can't actually have honest discussions about many issues. Ironically, it was more possible to do this under the British. I mean, obviously, they put all kinds of restrictions, but there was a willingness, I think, even of the people, maybe they were made of a better metal, of putting them out on print even in places like Bande Mataram, etc., even when they knew they were going to be retribution. So many of these issues were debated much more honestly by Lala Lajpat Rai, Tilak and others. Savarkar was just one important part of that debate, but there was a wider one that was happening. And what you see here is that many of these issues were widely debated, quite honestly, I would argue. And there were interestingly also a much more variety of thought even in other communities. I'm not just talking about the Hindu side of it. I mean, you had people like Ashfaqullah Khan, for example, coming up with a very liberal nationalist view of India, of nationalist ideas and so on, which somehow disappeared into the second half of the 20th century. The good news is, I think it is beginning to now open up in the last decade or two. There is a little more sort of opening of debate that has happened. So even as it appeared that the sort of woke revolution had kind of taken over everything, it also has caused the opposite to happen, in that it forced open alternative ways of thinking. Even in academia now, I occasionally come across people who are willing to take other views. So I think we are now entering an era of churn, you can call it, but I think there is much more debate and discussion that is happening.
Yeah. One issue that came up, during the course of my research, and I'd be failing in my duty if I don't mention that, is an episode of our history which has been again completely erased and whitewashed, so much so that most people would not even know that such a thing happened. That after Mahatma Gandhi's very heinous and tragic murder, there was a carnage of the Maharashtrian Brahmins in across Maharashtra, very, very similar to what happened in Delhi in 1984 against the Sikhs. So it was a trailer, 1984 and 48, you just interchange the digits. It was very curiously, within a few hours of the assassination, the caste of the assassins was publicized across the country. And orders came from the very top that people have to pay a price for this. And the same evening, communal violence, as they called it was not communal violence, it was a pogrom against one community, broke out, where initially anyone with the surname Godse was actually caught and burnt alive. Later on it extended to all the Chitpavan Brahmins, to the community to which they belonged, and later also to the Deshasthas and all other Maharashtrian Brahmins. Entire villages, so Bombay, Pune, Nagpur, and then Satara, Sangli, the Patwardhan princely states, Miraj, Kolhapur, even the Belagaum in Karnataka, and all of these places, entire villages were ethnically cleansed, like of the Kashmiri Pandits later, of Brahmin families. Even today, you would not find too many Brahmin households in those villages, because most of them migrated either to the Mysore state or they went away to Bombay, Pune, where they could live in anonymity, where their caste was not known, for the simple fact that they belonged to the same caste, they had nothing to do with politics, and they had to pay a price for it. And FIRs were not registered, cases were not filed, and it was only in the 1950s I quote this scholar called Maureen Patterson, who comes to India to investigate these cases, and she's quite aghast because the Maharashtra government and the Maharashtra police, they do not share any information with her, but she pieces together little bits of information, does a little bit of oral narratives and so on. I myself did that. I mean, I put it out on social media saying, if there are, it's a crowdsourcing of oral narratives, which is what a historian would fall back on when there's no written documents, saying, are there family histories, are there family stories you'd like to share? And I was overwhelmed with the outpouring of, family stories that came in from people I just don't know personally at all. They were all narrating these tales of how their properties were destroyed, how their family members were killed or burnt alive, and how they had to run away from their villages in thousands and thousands. And Maureen Patterson actually estimates 6 to 10 crores as the property damage in 1948. That's a huge sum, which she says was a gross underestimate at that time. Balji Pendharkar, the famous film director, his studio was gutted in Kolhapur, and in fact, the Maharaja of Kolhapur institutes a commission of inquiry called the Justice Koyaji Commission, which brings out some of these details. And curiously enough, the Home Minister of the central provinces, what is now Madhya Pradesh, Dwarka Prasad Mishra, DP Mishra, in his memoirs, he was a congressman. He writes very candidly that these goons who carried out these attacks were very, very influential Congress leaders who headed Congress committees and so on. Ironically, they were all till just the other day chanting verses of non-violence, and the messiah of non-violence is killed, and then you become so violent as a retribution. So that was the bad irony, where DP Mishra was repeatedly, a lot of pressure was put on him to ensure that the people who were arrested were all released. And if this was the Darka Mahal then, sadly now, after 7 decades, it's the same. So these individuals who wrote to me, when I asked them, I said, this is for the first time probably, these voices would come out in print. Can I actually identify you? Can I take you by your name? And 90% of them said, we are still scared. We do not want, so most of in the appendix, I've included all their testimonies in toto. Most of them is anonymous. And they say even now in Maharashtra, those who led those mobs, their descendants and those parties are in powerful positions. And so we are very scared. We have moved on. We have made our life and livelihoods. We would not want to destroy that by sticking our neck out and coming out with these details. So while we'll give you all the information, please don't put our names in print. And in fact, the amount of information that came out was so large that I decided to, collaborate with another, writer friend in Pune. And I even spoke to my publisher, Penguin, and Premanko Goswami, who's here, saying, shall we bring out a small booklet of sorts, not as thick as this, but a smaller version, precisely on the issue of the 1948 carnage. And this gentleman in Pune was very willing to collaborate with me. But later on, he, I think, socialized the idea among people there, and he, very scared, he called me one night and said, we were given the advice that don't touch this subject. Because Vikram Sampath lives in Bangalore, he's not going to get affected. You live in Maharashtra, you will pay the price for it, and you have family, you have a wife, you have a sister, you have children, so please don't put all their lives in risk. So that is the way in which, these testimonies, one thing is not getting justice, which probably in India, the judicial system, you never get justice for decades and centuries. But the denial of even the occurrence of such an event. You talk about this to someone, nothing like that happened, just some 2-3, this is some sung propaganda, all kinds of things is what is said usually. But then denial of even an occurrence, I think, adds insult to injury, where world over, where history offers this space for people to come and heal their wounds. We remember the Holocaust Museum, not to commemorate it, but to ensure that we never repeat these mistakes. Maybe if we had taken very strict action in 1948 and made an example of those who committed this, 1984 might not have happened. And it should never happen again against any community in India. So I think the more you bury history under the carpet and try to sanitize it with deodorant, the muck will not go away. The stench will at some point raise its head, and we need to stare that past in the eye and make peace with it, but move on from it. Let's not keep that rancor, that hatred, and that ill will in our hearts today, but healing that, making peace with it, I think is very essential.